From 2007, nearly all 600 plus F-14s began to be shredded and destroyed by the very nation that created them. It was arguably one of the greatest Navy fighters ever built, fitted with a super advanced radar that could track up to 24 targets at once, and guide what was the most powerful missile to ever enter service. When you were face to face with this machine, you knew you were in deep trouble. However, as powerful as this aircraft was, less than 30 of these exist today. This is the story of the F-14 Tomcat. Throughout the 1950s and 60s, aviation was advancing at an astonishing pace. With the dawn of the jet age, airplanes were flying faster, higher, and more efficiently. Missiles and radar technologies also saw massive advancements. These advancements were largely fueled by the geopolitical standoff between the two biggest superpowers of the time, the United States and the Soviet Union. After burning jet-powered aircraft were pushing boundaries of what was possible in the skies, advancements in radar technology enabled aircraft to detect multiple adversaries, increasing situational awareness. And missiles were getting faster and more accurate at long range. This all meant that the world of aerial combat was changing. Manufacturers and aircraft designers would have to adapt to this new world or risk getting left behind. Post-World War II, the United States military became the most dominant military in the world. However, with the rising influence and power of the Soviet Union, maintaining their position as number one wasn't going to be easy. The USSR was developing state-of-the-art long-range anti-ship cruise missiles that could skim over the surface of the ocean at supersonic speeds to avoid enemy radar and strike virtually undetected. These missiles could be launched from Soviet supersonic bombers such as the Tupolev Tu-95 or advanced submarines such as the Oscar-class SSGN. And the Soviet Union wasn't scared of using them, as we'll see later in this video. The F-4 Phantom, America's top Navy fighter at the time, sought to defend against these missiles. Similar to the new fighters of the time, it was powered by two pure afterburning turbojets that could produce nearly 18,000 pounds of thrust each. The wings were swept back to reach shockwave formation, allowing it to pierce through the skies at twice the speed of sound, at the expense of low-speed handling and maneuverability. The F-4 was built on the idea that future air combat would happen beyond visual range, so the F-4 Phantom was built without a gun, and as a result, its pilots weren't trained for dogfights. While this philosophy would eventually become standard decades later, the F-4 was simply ahead of its time, and it paid the price for it in blood, as seen in the Vietnam War, where the F-4's weaknesses would be exposed. The dogfights in Vietnam were chaotic. Friendlies and enemies were tangled together in a deadly swirl. The radar meant to distinguish friendly from foe often proved unreliable, forcing F-4 pilots to get dangerously close to the more nimble Soviet MiG-21s just to confirm the targets. With no guns, inadequate dogfight training, and a bulky airframe, the F-4 struggled to hold its own. Its radar couldn't see below, and its smoke-bleaching engines just made it obvious. And as a result, many pilots lost their lives. In response, the Americans quickly added guns and improved pilot training. It offered a temporary edge, but it was far from perfect. If the United States wished to maintain their military dominance, they needed more than just upgrades. They needed a new fighter jet. By the late 1950s, America was in a desperate need of a new fighter jet. Aircraft designers scrambled to come up with a new design, and in 1959, concepts of the Douglas F-16 Missileer were introduced. The aircraft sat in an awkward middle ground. It had large straight wings, good for low-speed landings and sharp turns, but terrible for reaching the high speeds necessary for evading enemies. It had an incredible payload capacity, but its weight limited its maneuverability. a trait that the United States had recently learned was incredibly useful. Just 2 years later, in December 1961, the project was cancelled, without ever leaving the drawing board, leaving the United States without a fleet defense aircraft and vulnerable to Soviet attacks. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, plans were being made in the Soviet Union that could potentially cripple the West. During the Cold War, US aircraft carriers were in constant patrol across the globe, projecting power and prepared to respond swiftly to any rising conflict. However, these carriers were often deployed in relatively small groups, and the Soviets were planning on taking advantage of this by conducting saturated missile attacks on the vulnerable US carrier fleets, launching swarms of anti-ship cruise missiles to overwhelm the carrier defenses. Without a powerful fleet defense aircraft, the United States stood no chance. A powerful fleet defense aircraft had to be built. To be able to defend against Soviet attacks, the United States would need an aircraft with a powerful radar, one that could detect enemies from vast distances, away from the carrier fleets, and long-range missiles that could engage those targets. The aircraft would also need to be maneuverable, in order for it to be able to hold its own in a dogfight situation. And lastly, speed, to allow it to catch up and intercept the Soviet bombers before they reach the carrier fleets, and evade enemies if necessary. These were the main requirements for a Navy fleet defense aircraft. Initial ideas from the Secretary of Defense suggested a versatile aircraft that would take on multiple roles and fit in within different branches of the military, to help decrease costs of building new aircraft for each branch. That is when Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara launched the Tactical Fighter Experimental Program, which aimed at creating one aircraft design that could serve in both the US Navy and the US Air Force. Luckily for the Americans, they already had the necessary systems and technologies to build a suitable fighter. They had the AIM-54 Phoenix missile that had a range of almost 200 kilometers, the AWG-9 radar that could track up to 24 targets from close to 300 kilometers away, which, unlike the radar on the F-4, also had look-down capabilities, and the TF-30 afterburning turbofan engine that could produce nearly 20,000 pounds of thrust. All that was left to do was build an aircraft around all of this. The result of this collaboration was the F-111 Aardvark, a shape-shifting aircraft that featured variable geometric wings that could sweep back and forth to optimize for the best flight performance. The wings would seep forward to increase the lift of the aircraft, making it easy for it to take off and land on the very limited space of the aircraft carriers. When approaching cruising speeds, the wings would sweep back, decreasing drag and allowing the plane to reach supersonic speeds. It was exactly what the United States needed. However, this one-size-fits-all approach would turn out to be a terrible idea, as both the Air Force and the Navy had very different requirements for their aircraft.
When the plane flew for the first time on December 21st, 1964, it immediately became obvious that there were a couple of issues. The aircraft was overweight, and the TF-30 engines were struggling to support the airframe, which resulted in a poor thrust-to-weight ratio, making it unsuitable to operate on aircraft carriers. The position of the canopy resulted in poor visibility. Attempts were made to fix the issues and it successfully served in the Army Air Force. However, the Navy variant, the F-111B, couldn't be saved and never entered operational service. It was cancelled in 1968, yet again leaving the United States without a fleet defense aircraft. After multiple failed attempts to find a capable fighter for the Navy fleet, hope began to fade. Incredible advancements in aerospace were being made in the Soviet Union.
The Soviets had just introduced their new MiG-25 Foxbat at an air show, a high-speed interceptor that could scream past Mach 2.8. And for the first time, the Americans were sweating in places they didn't know they could sweat, out of fear of losing air superiority. But then, a year later in 1969, Grumman stepped forward, unveiling plans for a new variable sweep wing aircraft. At first glance, it looked like the doomed F-111 all over again, but this time, history had other plans. Unlike the F-111, this new aircraft would specifically focus on meeting the requirements for the Navy. The variable sweep wings would automatically adjust depending on the flight regime. Forward swept wings during slow subsonic flights such as landings and takeoffs for maximum low-speed handling, and swept backwards during transonic flights to reduce shockwave formation and allow it to break through the sound barrier. Assisted by the TF-30 low bypass turbofan engines borrowed from the F-111, it could scream past Mach 2.3, but that was just the beginning. A high-mounted bubble canopy gave the pilot crystal clear 360-degree vision, perfect for spotting adversaries. Paired with the AWG-9 radar, which could track up to 24 targets simultaneously well beyond visual range, striking before the enemy even knew it was there. Beneath its belly sat 6 AIM-54 Phoenix missiles, the deadliest air-to-air missiles of the time, that could strike targets at a range roughly equivalent to the distance from Boston, USA to South Quebec, Canada. And if things got up close and personal, a 20mm Vulcan cannon could tear through the enemy aircraft at 100 rounds per second. This wasn't just a fighter jet. This was an airborne predator that would be designated as the F-14 Tomcat. When the Navy approved the designs for the F-14,
Without skipping a beat, Grumman launched straight into full-scale development, bypassing the prototype phase entirely to save time.
and just 22 months later after receiving the contract, the F-14 took its maiden flight on December 21st, 1970. This was a groundbreaking achievement. However, the Tomcat wasn't perfect. It had a massive weakness: its power source. The TF-30 engine, designed for straight-flying interceptors, struggled in the F-14's demanding flight envelope. High G turns starved the engine of air, leading to dangerous compressor stalls and sudden flameouts. And the consequences were deadly. In 1999, Lieutenant Cara Hultgreen lost her life in a tragic accident caused by this very flaw. The deadly TF-30 engines were replaced by the more powerful and reliable General Electric F-110 engines. The upgrade not only solved reliability issues, it gave the jet a boost of over 6,000 pounds of thrust and the ability to fly vertically at 900 kilometers per hour. On September 21st, 1974, the F-14 finally entered service. After decades of waiting, the Tomcat took off from the USS Enterprise on its first operational deployment. Its mission statement was simple: protect the Navy fleet at all costs. The F-14's capabilities would be put to the test on two separate occasions in the Gulf of Sidra, when two US Navy F-14s were on a patrol mission over international waters near the Gulf of Sidra. At the time, Libya had unlawfully claimed the Gulf as its own sovereign territory, drawing a so-called line of death that the United States refused to recognize. The patrol's main purpose was to send a message directly to the Libyan government that international waters would not be claimed by tyranny. The US had flown several missions in that area before, all without incident, but this time things would turn out very differently. The peaceful cruise at 25,000 feet was disturbed by a pulsing blip on one of the F-14's radar, a sign that they weren't alone in the skies. One blip turned into two, and seconds later, two flying objects got into visual range to where they could be identified as two Libyan Su-22 fitters piercing through the skies in a close formation, heading straight for the American F-14s. One of the Su-22s fired a missile, but missed, to which the F-14s responded by firing their own missiles, which took down both aircraft, killing one of the pilots, with zero damage being made to the F-14s. A similar engagement took place in 1989, where once again the F-14s came out victorious. As the Cold War heated up, one of the US's closest allies, Iran, was flooding with oil money and felt vulnerable to the Soviets' MiG-25 Foxbat. So they turned to the United States, requesting to buy 79 F-14s and in return, Iran offered oil and cash payments. Though hesitant at first, the United States sold the F-14s, and in 1974, Iran became the only foreign country to buy F-14 Tomcats. They also received training from American crews, and also the Phoenix missile. Then in 1979, the Shah was overthrown, and a new ruler who despised the US cut ties with America. But against all odds, Iran kept the Tomcats flying. Back in the United States, the F-14's fate had turned. Maintenance costs increased, newer jets took over, and fears of parts reaching Iran pushed the government to making the unfortunate decision to scrap all the F-14s. Out of 600 plus F-14s, less than 30 survived. By 2006, the F-14 was retired, leaving behind an unforgettable history.